The pickaxe struck bone beneath 3 feet of Alaskan snow. January 21st, 1868. The sound echoed across the silence like a gunshot. Freezing searcher Thomas Kelwick mid-swing as he stared down at what should have been bedrock, but was instead a human rib cage, yellowed and gnawed clean. This discovery would expose one of the most calculated cases of survival cannibalism in American frontier history, where desperation became deliberate and brothers became predators in plain sight. The wind howled through Birch Creek Valley with the persistence of a dying animal, carrying the metallic bite of approaching storms and the damp rot of permafrost. Underfoot, the snow crunched with the density of centuries-old ice, each step a reminder that this land consumed the unprepared without ceremony. Above, the aurora borealis painted the sky in sickly greens, casting shadows that moved like living things across the endless white. Brothers Henrik and Magnus Anderson had arrived in Alaska Territory in the spring of 1867, part of the wave of prospectors drawn north by rumors of gold strikes along the Yukon River. Unlike most miners who traveled in groups for safety, the Anderson brothers established their camp in deliberate isolation, a decision that locals in Circle City found peculiar but not worth questioning. Men came to Alaska to disappear from something, and the brothers' business was their own. Henrik, the elder at 34, stood tall and gaunt, with pale eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. His younger brother Magnus possessed a broader build and an easy smile that made strangers trust him quickly, a quality that proved more valuable than any mining equipment. Together, they built a substantial cabin 8 miles upstream from the nearest neighbor, complete with a large root cellar and smokehouse that seemed excessive for 2 men. The brothers claimed to be hunting for gold, but their behavior suggested different priorities. While other prospectors worked dawn to dusk with pan and sluice, the Andersons spent their time perfecting their living arrangements. They constructed elaborate traps along game trails, not for animals, but positioned in ways that would catch a man unaware. Their cabin featured multiple rooms, unusual for a mining operation, including a back chamber with no windows and walls thick enough to muffle sound. File notation: Circle City Trading Post, September 15, 1867. H. Anderson purchased unusual quantities of salt, rope, and cutting implements. No corresponding purchase of mining supplies. Paid in coin, not dust. Behavior noted as peculiar. By autumn, miners began arriving at the Anderson cabin with increasing frequency. The brothers had cultivated a reputation for hospitality, offering hot meals and shelter to travelers caught in early blizzards. Magnus would greet visitors with his characteristic warmth, while Henrik prepared elaborate feasts that exhausted men praised as the finest food they tasted in the territory. What these guests didn't realize was that they were the first to taste these particular recipes. The pattern emerged slowly. Miners would arrive at the cabin, drawn by smoke from the chimney and the promise of warmth. They would be welcomed inside, fed generously, and offered a place to sleep. But morning would come without the visitors, and the brothers would explain to any who asked that their guests had departed early, eager to reach their claims before winter set in completely. Local Athabascan tribes had noticed changes in the area by October. Game animals avoided the Anderson property entirely, creating an unnatural dead zone in the valley. Hunting parties reported strange smells carried on the wind. Not the clean scent of wood smoke, but something sweeter and more troubling. The tribal elders spoke of bad medicine at the white men's camp, but their warnings went unheeded by the European settlers who still viewed indigenous knowledge with dismissive skepticism. What would you do if you stumbled upon such a camp, isolated and wrong in ways you couldn't articulate, but where your survival might depend on their hospitality? The brothers had perfected their operation by November, when the first major snowstorms began trapping travelers in earnest. Their cabin became a beacon of salvation for desperate men, a reputation carefully cultivated through the survival of selected witnesses who were allowed to leave and spread word of Anderson generosity. But these witnesses had been chosen specifically, men traveling alone, without close connections, whose disappearances would raise no immediate alarms. They were building a reputation. As December's brutal cold settled over the valley, the Anderson brothers prepared for their most profitable season. The mining camps scattered throughout the region faced starvation as supply lines froze, creating a steady stream of desperate travelers willing to risk unknown dangers for the promise of food and shelter. The brothers' smokehouse worked continuously now, its chimney painting the stark landscape with plumes of aromatic smoke that drew the hungry like moths to flame. But among the Athabascan people, whispers began circulating about the white brothers who had learned to hunt a different kind of prey. Tribal scouts reported counting men entering the valley who were never seen leaving, while the brothers' own health and provisions seemed to flourish despite the devastating winter. The pieces of a horrific puzzle were falling into place, but the scattered mining community lacked the communication networks to see the emerging pattern. By year's end, at least 12 miners had vanished in the Birch Creek Valley, their disappearances attributed to the countless dangers of Alaska frontier life. Bears, exposure, accidents. Claim jumpers, the territory offered endless explanations for missing men. The Anderson brothers expressed appropriate concern when asked about their missing guests, even organizing search parties that somehow never found evidence of the lost miners. Yet beneath their carefully constructed facade, the brothers were making critical errors that would eventually expose their operation. Magnus Anderson's laughter carried across the frozen creek like breaking glass, echoing off the ice-covered pines as he dragged something heavy through the snow behind their cabin. February 3, 1868, just 2 weeks before their entire operation would unravel with a single misstep. The brothers had transformed murder into a systematic business, with each element designed to maximize both profit and concealment in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness. The morning air bit through wool and leather with the sharpness of steel blades, while the ground beneath creaked with the settling of permafrost that had never known warmth. Around the Anderson cabin, the snow bore strange patterns, drag marks leading toward the smokehouse, dark stains that could have been blood or rust, and an absence of animal tracks that spoke to predators, avoiding something fundamentally wrong. Henrik had designed their system with the precision of an engineer. The cabin's interior featured a hidden compartment beneath the main floor, accessed through a concealed trapdoor near the fireplace. This space, roughly 6 feet deep and 12 feet square, served as both holding area and butchering chamber. The brothers had lined the walls with sheets of tin recovered from abandoned mining equipment, creating surfaces that could be easily cleaned and wouldn't absorb odors or stains. Their selection process followed careful criteria. Ideal targets traveled alone, carried substantial supplies or money, and most importantly, had no clear destination or timeline that would trigger immediate searches. Magnus excelled at reading men during their initial conversations, identifying those whose disappearances would cause the least disturbance. He possessed an intuitive understanding of human desperation that allowed him to spot vulnerable travelers from considerable distances. The actual killings followed a ritualized pattern that maximized efficiency while minimizing struggle. Visitors would be welcomed inside and offered Henrik's signature stew, a rich, meaty concoction that masked the taste of ground opium poppy seeds gathered during their previous summer's foraging. As guests grew drowsy from the drugged food, Magnus would engage them in friendly conversation, while Henrik prepared the killing tools in the back room. Personal journal, Magnus Anderson, January 8, 1868. H believes we should space the disappearances further apart. I argue, the winter provides natural cover. Who questions missing men when bears sleep and wolves hunt desperately? The brothers' meat processing operation rivaled anything found in Chicago's stockyards. They had constructed a pulley system within their smokehouse that allowed them to handle bodies efficiently, while a series of cutting tables and specialized knives enabled them to break down human remains with butcher shop precision. Nothing was wasted, bones were ground for meal, organs were preserved in salt, and even clothing was cleaned and stored for future use or trade. Their preservation methods combined traditional European smoking techniques with native Alaskan practices learned through careful observation of local tribes. The brothers had experimented extensively with different wood combinations, finding that birch and alder produced the most appealing flavors, while masking any distinctive tastes that might raise suspicions. They developed specialized brines and rubs that enhanced palatability while extending storage life through the harsh winter months. Local wildlife provided the perfect cover story for their meat supplies. Alaska Territory teemed with game animals, and the brothers made sure to maintain hunting licenses and occasionally bring back legitimate kills to display in Circle City. They cultivated relationships with other hunters, trading small amounts of their processed human flesh mixed with genuine venison or moose meat, creating a distribution network that spread evidence while diluting suspicion. The economic aspects of their operation proved surprisingly profitable. Beyond the direct value of stolen supplies and money, human flesh commanded premium prices when presented as exotic game meat to buyers in the larger settlements. The brothers developed a client base among wealthy merchants and government officials who prized what they believed to be rare delicacies prepared by skilled hunters with access to unique protein sources. They were feeding their neighbors. By early February, the Anderson operation had reached industrial scale. Their smokehouse processed remains continuously, while their root cellar stored preserved meat in carefully labeled containers that would have impressed any commercial butcher. Henrik maintained detailed records of their inventory, tracking not just quantities, but also the source and processing dates of each batch to ensure optimal quality control. But success bred carelessness. The brothers had grown comfortable with their routine, confident that their remote location and the harsh winter provided absolute security. They began taking greater risks, attacking travelers in larger groups, operating in daylight hours, and most dangerously, killing men whose disappearances would not go unnoticed by the outside world. Their first major mistake occurred on February 14th, when they murdered prospector James Whitmore, who had been carrying mail contracts to deliver correspondence between mining camps. Whitmore's failure to appear at scheduled stops would trigger coordinated search efforts involving multiple communities, something the isolated brothers had never faced before. The second error proved even more catastrophic. In their confidence, they had begun preserving clothing and personal effects as trophies rather than destroying evidence. Henrik's systematic nature had led him to catalog these items in the same meticulous way he tracked their meat inventory, creating a paper trail that would damn them both if discovered. What drove men to cross lines that most couldn't imagine approaching, and how many warnings did others ignore because the alternative truth seemed impossible? As February's end approached, the brothers prepared for their largest operation yet, the systematic elimination of a three-man surveying party that had requested shelter while mapping potential railroad routes through the valley. Blood froze before it could pool on the cabin floor. February 22nd, 1868 surveyor David Chen pressed his eye to the crack in the back room wall and watched Henrik Anderson methodically sharpen a bone saw while humming a Norwegian folk tune. Chen's discovery would expose the brothers' operation, but only after he became their most dangerous victim, one who escaped to tell the tale. The surveying party had arrived 3 days earlier during a blizzard that turned the world into a wall of white noise, the wind shrieking through the valley with the persistence of tortured spirits. Inside the Anderson cabin, the air hung thick with wood smoke and the sweet aroma of slow-cooked meat, while outside, snow piled against the windows in drifts that promised weeks of isolation. The surveyor's boots left deep impressions in the soft pine flooring, each step a reminder that these men carried the weight of official business rather than the desperate hunger of typical winter travelers. David Chen, the lead surveyor for the proposed Alaska Territory Railway expansion, had initially felt grateful for the brothers' hospitality. His team cartographer William Morrison and engineer Thomas Kelwick had been mapping potential routes through Birch Creek Valley when the storm caught them miles from their base camp. The Anderson cabin appeared like salvation through the driving snow, its windows glowing warmly against the hostile landscape. Magnus had welcomed them with characteristic enthusiasm, offering hot coffee laced with whiskey and plates of what he described as specially prepared moose steaks. The meat possessed an unusual tenderness and complex flavor that impressed even Chen, who had eaten game throughout the territories. Henrik remained more reserved but equally hospitable, ensuring their horses were sheltered and their equipment secured against the weather. The first indication of danger came during their second night. Chen had awakened to use the outdoor privy and noticed light emanating from beneath the smokehouse door, unusual for the early morning hours. More troubling was the sound accompanying the light, rhythmic chopping, punctuated by periods of silence, as if someone were working methodically through a large cutting project. When he mentioned this to his companions the next morning, Henrik explained that he processed meat during night hours to avoid attracting scavengers. Survey log, David Chen, February 21st, 1868. Weather clearing slowly. Brothers insist we remain another day for safety. Morrison, developing stomach illness from rich food. Something feels incorrect about this place. Chen's suspicions crystallized when he noticed inconsistencies in the brothers' stories about their background and activities. Henrik claimed they had been prospecting for 2 years, yet their cabin showed evidence of much longer occupation. Magnus mentioned hunting successfully throughout the winter, but no fresh animal tracks led to or from their property. Most disturbing were the personal items Chen glimpsed while exploring the cabin clothing, jewelry, and tools that clearly belonged to multiple different men, far more than 2 brothers would require. The crucial discovery occurred when Chen investigated strange sounds coming from behind the cabin's back wall. A loose board revealed a narrow gap that provided a view into the brothers' hidden butchering chamber. What he saw through that crack would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Henrik methodically processing what appeared to be human remains, while Magnus sorted through personal belongings taken from victims. Chen realized immediately that his survey team had walked into a carefully constructed trap. The brothers' excessive hospitality, their insistence that the weather remained too dangerous for travel, and their obvious wealth, despite claiming to be unsuccessful, miners all formed a pattern of predatory behavior designed to isolate and eliminate witnesses. The rich meat they had been consuming with such appreciation was almost certainly human flesh, prepared with the skill of experienced butchers. Death was being served for dinner. Rather than confronting the brothers directly or attempting to warn his companions immediately, Chen made the strategic decision to gather evidence while planning their escape. He used his surveying skills to create detailed observations of the cabin's layout, the brothers' routines, and the location of weapons and potential evidence. His engineering background helped him identify structural weaknesses in the cabin that could be exploited during an emergency escape. The challenge lay in communicating with Morrison and Kelwick without alerting their hosts. Morrison's continuing illness provided cover for private conversations, allowing Chen to brief his companions on the danger they faced. Initially, both men struggled to believe Chen's claims the brothers' behavior seemed genuinely friendly, and the alternative explanation required accepting that they had been unknowingly consuming human flesh for 3 days. Kelwick, the engineer, proved more receptive to Chen's warnings after discovering additional evidence in the form of surveying equipment that belonged to a mapping party that had disappeared the previous autumn. The instruments bore distinctive markings that Kelwick recognized from territorial records, confirming that other professionals had met fatal ends at the Anderson cabin. This discovery convinced Morrison despite his illness, and the 3 men began planning their escape. The brothers' behavior began shifting subtly as they sensed their guests growing suspicious. Henrik's questions about their survey routes became more probing, while Magnus showed excessive interest in their timeline and expected return to base camp. Both brothers began watching the surveyors more carefully, and Chen noticed that one of them remained awake throughout each night, ostensibly tending the fire, but actually maintaining surveillance. Their escape window was closing rapidly. The weather had cleared sufficiently for travel, eliminating the brothers' primary excuse for detaining them. Chen realized that the Andersons were likely planning to kill the survey team within the next 24 hours, probably during the evening meal when their victims would be relaxed and potentially drugged. How many other professional men had sat in this same cabin, sharing meals and conversation, never suspecting that their hosts were calculating the best methods for their disposal? On the morning of February 24th, Chen made the decision that would save their lives but also unleash the brothers' most desperate and violent behavior yet. Chen's boots slipped on the ice-covered porch as Magnus Anderson's axe split the doorframe inches from his skull. February 24th, 1868. The surveyor stumbled into the blinding morning snow with his companions behind him and the sound of splintering wood marking their transformation from guest to prey. Their escape had begun perfectly until Morrison's weakened condition turned their calculated retreat into a deadly chase across the frozen wilderness. The morning air cut through their lungs like ground glass, each breath visible in crystalline puffs that dissipated instantly in the sub-zero temperature. Beneath their feet, the snow crunched with the brittleness of centuries-old ice, while the wind carried the metallic scent of approaching weather and the distant howls of wolves drawn by the scent of desperation. Behind them, the Anderson cabin erupted with shouts and the crash of overturned furniture as the brothers discovered their guests' sudden departure. Chen's plan had relied on subterfuge and careful timing. The surveyors had awakened before dawn and quietly gathered their essential equipment while the brothers slept. They planned to slip away during the early morning hours, claiming they needed to take measurements while weather conditions remained stable. Their horses had been prepared the previous evening under the pretense of checking their condition after the storm. The deception unraveled when Morrison, still weakened by days of consuming drugged food and possibly human flesh, collapsed while attempting to saddle his mount. His fall startled the animals and created enough noise to wake Henrik, who immediately recognized the sound of men attempting to leave without permission. Within moments, both brothers had armed themselves and blocked the cabin's main exit. Chen's surveying experience proved invaluable during those crucial seconds. He had studied the cabin's layout extensively and remembered a secondary exit through the rear storage room. While Magnus confronted them at the front door with accusations and barely concealed threats, Chen led his companions through the cabin's interior toward their alternate escape route. Henrik's discovery of their movement through the back rooms triggered the violent pursuit that would continue for the next 48 hours. Personal effects recovered later. Morrison's surveying compass, bearing scratches consistent with use as a weapon. Chen's field notebook, containing detailed observations of cabin layout and brothers' behavioral patterns. The initial chase favored the brothers, who knew the terrain intimately and had prepared for exactly this scenario. They pursued the surveyors on foot, using snowshoes that allowed rapid movement across the deep drifts that slowed the fleeing men. Magnus carried his preferred killing axe, while Henrik bore a modified hunting rifle that he had adapted for close-quarters combat in dense forest conditions. Morrison's condition deteriorated rapidly under the stress of flight. The combination of physical weakness, cold exposure, and the psychological trauma of discovering their situation pushed him toward complete collapse. Chen and Kelwick were forced to support him between them, drastically reducing their speed and creating a clear trail through the snow that their pursuers could follow effortlessly. The surveyor's salvation came from Chen's professional knowledge of the valley's topography. His team had spent weeks mapping the region's geological features, including a series of abandoned mining shafts that dotted the landscape like hidden graves. These excavations, relics of failed prospecting ventures, provided potential shelter that the brothers might not know existed. Chen guided his companions toward the largest of these sites, located approximately 3 miles from the Anderson cabin. They were running toward darkness. The mining shaft offered temporary refuge, but created new dangers. The excavation descended roughly 30 feet into permanently frozen ground, with wooden supports that showed concerning signs of decay. The surveyors climbed down using makeshift ropes fashioned from their equipment straps, reaching a narrow chamber that provided protection from both weather and immediate pursuit, but trapped them underground with limited supplies and no alternate escape route. Above ground, the brothers demonstrated the systematic hunting skills they had developed through months of tracking human prey. Rather than attempting immediate pursuit down the shaft, they established positions around the excavation's perimeter and began a siege designed to force their quarry into surrender or death by exposure. Magnus constructed a fire using materials from their emergency kit, creating smoke that would prevent the surveyors from remaining hidden indefinitely. Henrik's approach proved more sophisticated and terrifying. He began calling down into the shaft, not with threats or demands, but with casual conversation that demonstrated his complete confidence in the outcome. He described the meals they had shared, praising Morrison's appreciation for the specially prepared meat. He detailed their butchering techniques with clinical precision, explaining how they would process the surveyor's remains once cold and starvation forced them to surrender. The psychological warfare continued throughout the day and into the following night. The brothers took turns maintaining the siege, while their trapped victims huddled in the frozen darkness below, listening to detailed descriptions of their planned fate. Chen used this time to examine their situation methodically, searching for weaknesses in their captor's strategy or structural features of the shaft that might enable escape. Morrison's condition reached critical levels during their second night underground. He developed symptoms consistent with severe hypothermia and possible poisoning from the drugged food he had consumed over previous days. His delirium included vivid hallucinations and periods of violent shaking that threatened to alert the brothers to their exact location within the shaft's chambers. How long could trained professionals survive in conditions designed to break down human will? And what would they be willing to sacrifice to see morning again? Chen realized that their only hope lay in exploiting the brothers' overconfidence, but his plan would require sacrificing one of them to save the others. Kelwick's scream echoed up the shaft walls as Henrik Anderson's rifle shot shattered his left shoulder. February 26, 1868. Chen watched his companion fall back into the darkness, while Morrison lay motionless from hypothermia, and their captors prepared for the final assault. The engineer's sacrifice would create the distraction needed for Chen's escape, but at a cost that would haunt the survivor for decades. The pre-dawn air carried the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the metallic tang of fresh blood, while the shaft's walls wept condensation that froze into razor-thin sheets of ice before reaching the bottom. Above, the brothers moved with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey, their voices echoing down the excavation with casual discussions of butchering techniques and meat preservation methods. Below, 3 men faced the mathematics of survival, where only one might see sunrise. Chen's plan required exploiting the brothers' methodical nature and their desire to capture rather than simply kill their victims. Henrik and Magnus had invested considerable effort in this hunt, and their operation depended on processing bodies efficiently rather than leaving evidence scattered across the landscape. This meant they would attempt to retrieve the surveyors alive, creating a brief window of vulnerability during their descent into the shaft. The engineer Thomas Kelwick had volunteered for the most dangerous role, despite his lack of military experience. His background in construction and demolition provided knowledge of structural engineering that proved crucial to Chen's strategy. Kelwick identified weak points in the shaft's wooden support system that could be exploited to create collapse zones, potentially trapping one of the brothers underground while the others escaped. Morrison's deteriorating condition eliminated him as an active participant in their escape attempt. The cartographer had slipped into unconsciousness during the night, his breathing shallow and irregular. Chen faced the terrible decision of whether to attempt carrying Morrison during their escape or abandoning him to improve their own survival chances. The mathematics of survival in sub-zero conditions with armed pursuers suggested that saving Morrison would likely result in all three men dying. Mining accident report, Birch Creek Valley, 1865. Shaft instability, common due to permafrost conditions. Wooden supports require replacement every 6 months to prevent catastrophic failure. The brothers' assault began at first light when Henrik descended into the shaft using climbing equipment they had retrieved from their cabin. His approach demonstrated professional competence, with proper ropes and anchoring systems that suggested experience with vertical operations. Magnus remained above ground with his rifle, positioned to prevent escape attempts while providing covering fire for his brother's descent. Kelwick initiated their counterattack when Henrik reached approximately halfway down the shaft. Using a makeshift lever constructed from surveying equipment, the engineer triggered the partial collapse of a support beam section directly above Henrik's position. The falling timber struck the brothers' climbing rope and dislodged several loose rocks, creating enough chaos for Kelwick to attack with improvised weapons. The close-quarters combat that followed lasted less than 30 seconds, but determined the fate of all involved parties. Henrik possessed superior weapons and physical conditioning, but Kelwick fought with the desperation of a man protecting his companions' lives. Their struggle damaged the shaft's remaining support structures and created the opportunity Chen needed to begin his ascent toward the surface. Henrik's rifle shot ended Kelwick's resistance, but also served as the signal for Chen's final gambit. While Magnus focused on the gunshot and his brother's shouts from below, Chen emerged from the shaft's opposite side using handholds he had identified during their imprisonment. His surveying experience with rope and climbing techniques enabled him to reach ground level undetected, positioning him behind Magnus's firing position. The hunter became the hunted. Chen's attack on Magnus utilized surveying tools as weapons, specifically a heavy transit instrument that served as an effective club. The surprise assault succeeded in disabling Magnus temporarily, but Henrik's emergence from the shaft created a new threat that forced Chen to flee before confirming his opponent's condition. The surveyor ran toward their original base camp, abandoning both Morrison and the wounded Kelwick to their fate. The next 6 hours tested Chen's survival skills against the brothers' tracking abilities and the harsh Alaskan environment. His head start provided temporary advantage, but the brothers knew the terrain intimately and possessed superior equipment for winter travel. Chen's route toward the survey base camp followed mapped trails, but deep snow and exhaustion slowed his progress while his pursuers gained ground steadily. Chen's salvation came from an unexpected source: a routine patrol by territorial soldiers conducting winter exercises in the region. The military unit discovered Chen approximately 8 miles from the Anderson cabin, suffering from severe exposure but still conscious enough to communicate the essential details of their situation. The soldiers' immediate response included medical treatment for Chen and preparation for armed intervention against the brothers. What drives human beings to such extremes of survival? And how do we measure the value of one life against another when death stalks everyone equally? By evening, a combined military and civilian force was moving toward the Anderson cabin, but they would arrive too late to prevent the brothers' final, most desperate act. Smoke billowed from the Anderson cabin's windows as Lieutenant Marcus Webb approached through the evening twilight. February 27, 1868, the brothers had chosen to destroy evidence rather than face capture, but their escape plan would claim more victims before the night ended. The military intervention arrived 12 hours too late to prevent the brothers from completing their most calculated murder spree, turning desperation into systematic elimination of witnesses. The approaching darkness carried the sharp crack of burning timber, mixed with something sweeter and more disturbing, while the snow around the cabin bore deep gouges from heavy objects being dragged toward the creek. Lieutenant Webb's patrol had covered 18 miles through difficult terrain after receiving Chen's report, their horses struggling through drifts that reached the animals' bellies in some areas. Behind them, A civilian posse from Circle City followed with additional supplies and men familiar with the brothers' reputation in the region. Webb's military experience included frontier conflicts throughout the Western Territories, but the scene at the Anderson property exceeded anything from his previous campaigns. The brothers had spent their final hours methodically destroying evidence while preparing for a running battle that would allow them to disappear into the vast Alaskan wilderness. Their systematic approach to evidence destruction revealed the true scope of their operation and confirmed Chen's most horrific suspicions. The cabin's interior had been stripped of anything that could implicate the brothers in their victims' deaths. Personal effects, clothing, and identifying documents had been fed to an enormous fire that consumed the building's back rooms. However, their haste in destroying evidence created new problems. The intense heat weakened structural supports and filled the building with smoke that would make extended occupation impossible. Outside, Webb's men discovered the brothers' killing ground behind the smokehouse. The area contained a butchering station equipped with specialized tools, drainage systems, and processing equipment that rivaled commercial meatpacking operations. Most disturbing were the carefully organized human remains that the brothers hadn't had time to destroy bone fragments, personal items, and preserved tissue that represented dozens of victims dating back several years. Military report. Lieutenant Webb, February 27, 1868. Evidence suggests organized cannibalistic operation involving minimum 30 victims. Brothers departed approximately 4 hours before our arrival. Tracking conditions favorable. The brothers' escape strategy demonstrated the same methodical planning that characterized their murders. They had prepared emergency caches of supplies throughout the valley, creating a network of hidden resources that would support extended flight through winter conditions. Their route avoided established trails while following natural features that would obscure tracking efforts and provide defensive positions if confronted by pursuers. Henrik and Magnus had also eliminated potential witnesses during their final hours at the cabin. The survey team's horses had been slaughtered and partially processed, while Morrison and Kelwick's remains showed evidence of deliberate mutilation designed to obscure identification. This systematic destruction of evidence suggested the brothers intended to claim their victims had never reached the cabin, maintaining their cover story even after fleeing the territory. They left nothing behind but bones. Webb divided his forces to maximize their chances of intercepting the fleeing brothers. Half the patrol followed the most obvious escape route toward the Yukon River, where the brothers might attempt to reach Canadian territory. The remaining men, including Webb himself, pursued tracks leading deeper into the mountains where the brothers could establish defensive positions but would face increasing supply challenges as winter continued. The pursuit through mountainous terrain tested both hunters and hunted against conditions that killed unprepared travelers regularly. Temperatures dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit, while wind speeds exceeded 50 miles per hour in exposed areas. The brothers' familiarity with the landscape provided advantages, but their pursuers possessed superior numbers and military equipment designed for extended operations in hostile environments. Contact occurred during the second day of pursuit, when Webb's advance scouts located the brothers' camp in a natural shelter formed by fallen timber and rock formations. The position offered excellent defensive capabilities, but limited escape routes, exactly the type of terrain that favored disciplined military tactics over individual survival skills. The brothers had chosen to fight rather than continue running, possibly because Magnus's injuries from Chen's attack had slowed their progress significantly. The confrontation lasted approximately 30 minutes and involved coordinated flanking movements that prevented the brothers from using their superior knowledge of local terrain. Henrik's military experience became apparent during the engagement. His defensive preparations and tactical decisions suggested professional training that exceeded typical frontier survival skills. However, Magnus's deteriorating condition from untreated wounds limited their effectiveness as a fighting unit. Henrik's final stand occurred when military forces breached their defensive perimeter. Rather than surrender, He chose to fight to the death, while Magnus attempted escape through a narrow ravine that led toward the creek system. This decision reflected the brothers' understanding that capture would result in execution after public trial, while death in combat might preserve some element of their carefully constructed reputation. What transforms ordinary men into calculating predators, and how many similar operations existed in territories too remote for discovery. Magnus Andersson's escape into the wilderness would spawn legends that persisted for generations, but the immediate threat to Birch Creek Valley had ended with Henrik's death. Magnus Andersson's footprints disappeared into the creek bed as the ice began breaking up beneath the spring thaw. March 15th, 1868. Lieutenant Webb stared at the water running red with snowmelt and something darker, knowing that the surviving brother had vanished into a wilderness that could hide a man forever. The search for Magnus would consume resources and lives for months, while spawning reports of cannibalistic attacks throughout the Northern Territories that may have been coincidence or continuation of the brothers' work. The creek water moved with the sluggish persistence of melting permafrost, carrying debris from upstream camps and the metallic taste of minerals leached from thawing ground. Along the banks, early spring vegetation pushed through the snow in patches of sickly green, while the air carried the damp rot of organic matter finally released from winter's grip. Webb's tracking team had followed Magnus's trail for 6 days before losing it at this confluence of waterways that offered dozens of escape routes into unmapped territory. Magnus's survival skills exceeded his brothers, according to intelligence gathered from their former neighbors in Circle City. While Henrik possessed military training and tactical knowledge, Magnus understood wilderness survival with the intuition of someone raised in harsh environments. His ability to live off minimal resources and move through difficult terrain without leaving traces had enabled their cannibalistic operation to continue undetected for years. The territorial government's response to the Andersson case revealed the challenges of law enforcement across Alaska's vast distances and scattered population centers. Circle City's marshal had been investigating suspicious disappearances for months before Chen's report provided the crucial evidence needed to organize coordinated action. However, the delay between discovery and military intervention had allowed Magnus to escape with detailed knowledge of law enforcement capabilities and limitations. Territorial Marshal's Report, March 20th, 1868. Search operations suspended due to resource constraints and spring breakup conditions. Magnus Andersson presumed fled to Canadian territory or deceased from exposure. Case remains open pending discovery of additional evidence. Reports of Magnus's survival began filtering in from remote mining camps and trading posts throughout the spring and summer of 1868. These accounts described encounters with a lone prospector who matched Magnus's physical description and displayed unusual knowledge of meat preservation techniques. Most disturbing were reports of missing travelers along routes where this mysterious figure had been seen, creating a pattern that suggested continued predatory behavior. The psychological impact on survivors and witnesses extended far beyond the immediate victims. Chen never fully recovered from his ordeal, developing what military doctors described as persistent nervous exhaustion that prevented him from returning to surveying work. He relocated to California and spent his remaining years writing detailed accounts of the brothers' operation, becoming obsessed with warning others about the signs of cannibalistic behavior in frontier communities. The hunger never left him. Local Athabascan tribes had recognized the brothers' true nature months before European settlers acknowledged the danger. Tribal elders later revealed that their hunting parties had avoided the Birch Creek Valley throughout the previous winter, after discovering human remains in areas frequented by the brothers. However, cultural barriers and linguistic differences had prevented effective communication of these warnings to the mining communities that became the brothers' primary hunting ground. The discovery of the brothers' operation triggered changes in territorial law enforcement procedures and intercommunity communication networks. Mining camps began implementing registration systems for travelers, while trading posts established protocols for reporting overdue arrivals. These measures provided some protection against future predatory operations, but could not address the fundamental isolation that made such crimes possible in frontier territories. Evidence recovered from the Anderson property continued yielding new information throughout 1868, as investigators processed the massive amount of physical evidence left behind. Personal effects identified at least 37 individual victims dating back to 1865, while bone fragments suggested the actual number might have exceeded 50 people. The brothers' systematic record-keeping had documented their victims' names, physical characteristics, and processing methods with clinical precision. Magnus's escape route through the mountain passes led toward established smuggling corridors used by traders operating between American and Canadian territories. These routes offered access to remote communities where questions about background and previous activities were rarely asked. A man with Magnus's skills could establish a new identity and continue operating with minimal risk of detection, especially in regions where law enforcement remained virtually non-existent. The spring thaw revealed additional evidence of the brothers' activities scattered throughout the valley. Bone fragments and personal items emerged from snowdrifts and creek beds as the winter cover melted away. Each discovery reinforced the scope of their operation, while providing investigators with new leads about victims who had never been reported missing by their home communities. How many Magnus Andersons disappeared into the vast wilderness of 19th century America, carrying their hunger and knowledge to new territories where they could begin again? The final chapter of the Anderson story would be written not by law enforcement or military action, but by the harsh mathematics of frontier survival and one man's inability to control his appetite for human flesh. The trading post at Fort Yukon burned to the ground on October 13, 1869, with 3 men trapped inside, and Magnus Anderson's laughter echoing across the frozen river. 18 months after his escape, the surviving brother had finally made a fatal miscalculation that would end his reign of terror in the most fitting way possible. This final confrontation would close the Anderson case while creating a legend that frontier communities would whisper about for generations. The October air carried the bitter promise of early winter mixed with the acrid smoke of burning timber and something far worse, while the Yukon River reflected the orange glow of flames that could be seen for miles across the tundra. Around the trading post, the permafrost had already begun its annual freeze, creating ground so hard that digging graves would be impossible until spring returned. Above, the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green fire that seemed to mock the smaller blaze, consuming the last evidence of Magnus Anderson's existence. Magnus had spent the intervening months establishing a new identity as a successful trapper and meat supplier to remote outposts throughout the Northern Territories. His operation mirrored the brothers' previous system, but on a smaller scale, targeting isolated travelers and processing their remains into jerky and preserved meat that he sold to communities desperate for protein during the harsh winters. His reputation for providing high-quality provisions had spread throughout the region, creating a network of customers who never questioned the source of his seemingly inexhaustible supplies. The trading post proprietor, Samuel Kowalski, had grown suspicious of Magnus's operation during their months of business relationship. Kowalski possessed extensive experience with wilderness hunting and meat processing, and he recognized inconsistencies in Magnus's explanations about his trapping methods and territory. Most troubling was the absence of fur pelts that should have accompanied legitimate hunting operations. Magnus sold only meat and preserved foods, claiming that animals in his territory suffered from mange that made their pelts worthless. Trading Post Ledger, Fort Yukon, September 30th, 1869. M. Anderson delivered 40 pounds preserved meat. Quality exceptional, but source remains questionable. No fur pelts offered, despite claims of extensive trapping operation. Kowalski's investigation revealed disturbing patterns in the disappearances that coincided with Magnus's supply deliveries. Travelers who stopped at the trading post often mentioned encounters with a friendly trapper who offered directions to better hunting areas or shortcuts through difficult terrain. These travelers frequently failed to reach their intended destinations, while Magnus's meat deliveries increased following their disappearances. The confrontation occurred when Kowalski discovered human clothing and personal effects among Magnus's trading goods. The items belonged to a surveyor who had disappeared 3 weeks earlier after accepting Magnus's offer to guide him through unmapped territory. When confronted with this evidence, Magnus initially attempted to maintain his cover story before recognizing that his operation had been exposed. The mask finally slipped. Magnus's response demonstrated the same calculated violence that had characterized his brother's behavior. Rather than fleeing immediately, he chose to eliminate Kowalski and the 2 customers present at the trading post, a decision that reflected his confidence in his ability to destroy evidence and continue operating under a new identity. However, Magnus had underestimated both his opponent's fighting capabilities and the trading post's construction materials. The fight lasted approximately 10 minutes and resulted in the trading post's complete destruction by fire. Magnus had attempted to use burning lamp oil as a weapon, but the flames spread rapidly through the building's dry timber construction. His intended victims became trapped in the blaze along with Magnus himself, creating a situation where survival required cooperation between hunter and prey. Kowalski survived the fire with severe burns, but lived long enough to provide a detailed account of Magnus's final moments. The trapper had revealed his true identity during their struggle, boasting about his brother's death and his own success at continuing their cannibalistic operation. However, his confidence turned to panic as the flames spread beyond his control, trapping him in the same building he had intended to use as a crematorium for his victims. Magnus Anderson died as he had lived, consuming others while being consumed in return. Witnesses from nearby camps reported hearing screams from the burning building that continued long after any normal person would have succumbed to smoke inhalation. Some claimed they heard multiple voices, as if all of Magnus's victims had returned to drag him into the flames that would serve as his final judgment. The Fort Yukon incident marked the official end of law enforcement efforts to capture Magnus Anderson. Territorial authorities classified him as deceased based on witness testimony and physical evidence recovered from the trading post ruins. However, his body was never definitively identified among the remains, leading to persistent rumors about his possible survival and continued activities in even more remote territories. How do we measure justice when it comes not from human law, but from the same wilderness that enabled such horrors to flourish in darkness? The Anderson brothers' legacy lived on in the cautionary tales passed between frontier communities and the changed behaviors of those who learned to recognize the signs of predatory hospitality in isolation. Even today, hunters in remote areas of Alaska report finding old campsites with too many bones scattered nearby and the lingering scent of smoke that carries something sweet and wrong on the mountain wind. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.